It's such a pleasure for me to be here today. I live in Centennial and came up to deliver this part of the winter lecture series. Let me just give you a tiny bit of background so you understand where I'm coming from. I'm actually an electrical engineer. I spent 40 years in the electric utility industry planning new power plants and serving as an expert witness. And along the way, I became very involved in the Society of Women Engineers and started nominating women for awards and learning about women's stories and learning that women's stories weren't told and weren't part of the history. So now I've actually morphed into an advocate for telling women's stories. Her Story, A Timeline of the Women Who Changed America was actually my 5th book. It came out in hardback in 2008 and in paperback in 2013. This is now what I'm committed to doing, is writing women back into history and telling women's stories. The next book, which will be coming out, well, we thought we were actually going to do a book launch on March 14th at the C Film Center in Denver, but it looks like we won't have books. So it will be a different date. And that book is called Hollywood, Her Story, An Illustrated History of Women in the Movies. So I am now working to make sure that we're restoring the narrative of history. It's not revising history, it's telling all of the stories. That's actually one of the reasons I'm here today, to talk about African American women through history. One more thing about me, I was inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame in 2010. You can see my video that was run on Rocky Mountain PBS in February of 2018 by going to the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame website, which is cogreatwomen.org, going to the inductee video library, and my video is titled, and you'll see my name and more information about me. It's called Engineering Women Back into History. So I'm delighted to be here during February, which is Black History Month, to talk about Black women throughout history in America. And there are so many of them that this is just like a little sample of women through history. This is actually now in the upper right, Hattie McDaniel, who has been inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame, the first African American to win an Oscar, and she won it for her portrayal of Mammy in Gone with the Wind. That was Best Supporting Actress Oscar in 1940. And she, if I recall correctly, I believe she went to East High School in Denver. So that's actually her Colorado connection, but you can see more about that also on the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame website. This is a sample page from the book, just to give you an idea. It's a very visual book, so that it's very accessible information so that you can find the women. There are 2 indexes in the back that help you find them. One is alphabetical and one is by profession, so that you can find the women in the book. Often I do these presentations in chronological fashion. I'm not doing that today. I'm doing it by topic area. So because it doesn't work chronologically. I will say you're welcome to ask me questions as we go through the presentation. There's also, I'm going to make sure that I've timed it and that I've allowed for time for questions at the end as well. And I will tell you, I build up a pretty good head of steam. Sometimes it's hard to stop me, but I can do that also if you have a question that just can't wait, and please go ahead and feel free to ask it. So Black women first came to the U.S. before it was the U.S. as part of the slave trade. In 1622, a woman named Mary arrived as a slave in Jamestown. Later, she became one of the first freed slaves in the U.S. who sued for the right to choose her own surname. She and her husband selected the name Johnson because it's believed that that was the name of the benefactor who helped them get to freedom. I was mentioning a little bit earlier before this lecture started, I'm originally from Virginia. And so this case, I hadn't heard of Mary Johnson. I also haven't heard of this next woman whose name is Elizabeth Key. She sued for her freedom in 1655. It was actually a petition that she filed with the Virginia General Assembly, and it was granted. And then Mum Bet, who's shown here on the slide, in 1780 in Massachusetts, she was serving dinner and she overheard conversations about freedom, establishing government, things that were going on after the Revolutionary War in Massachusetts. And the wheels started turning in her head, and she started thinking, freedom, maybe that applies to me too. And so she actually found an attorney willing to take her case, as well as the case of another slave of the family in which they were enslaved. And the name of that case is Brom and Bet versus Ashley, argued before a Massachusetts county court, and she became one of the first slaves to be freed under the Massachusetts Constitution, that said there would be freedom, of 1781. And because of that court case, the remaining Massachusetts slaves were also freed. She changed her name later to Elizabeth Freeman, and a great-grandchild of hers was civil rights activist, sociologist, and author W.E.B. Du Bois. One of the things that since we don't know these women, we don't know their historical connection and the significance of the things that they've done. Now, these two women might be more familiar to this audience. On the left, Sojourner Truth, and on the right, Harriet Tubman. I'm also going to talk about Maria Stuart and Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Maria Stuart was the first American-born female lecturer, African-American, who encouraged blacks to become educated and then to press for their rights. Sojourner Truth was known previously as Isabella Baumfree, gained her freedom in 1827 and changed her name to Sojourner Truth in 1843. She's probably best known for her 1851 speech, Ain't I a Woman, which was delivered in Akron, Ohio at the Women's Rights Convention in 1851. Some of you may be familiar with the activity to get women on paper money in the US. It was actually under the auspices of an organization called WomenOn20s.org. I'm a member of that organization. I actually helped write the bios that went on the website for the voting to get women on 20s. And as a result of that voting effort, there was a commitment by the United States Department of the Treasury. Harriet Tubman would be the face of the 20. On the back of the 10 would be Sojourner Truth, Alice Paul, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and whoever else I'm forgetting. And, Susan B. Anthony. How horrible to forget Susan B. Anthony. And then on the back of the 5 would be Martin Luther King, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Marian Anderson. So you may remember or know Harriet Tubman's story. Hers is very well known. A woman who was on the eastern shore of Maryland, who was a slave, escaped to Philadelphia, and then went back 19 times, estimated to have rescued 300 people from slavery. She was called the Moses of her people. Harriet Tubman did whatever actually it took to get the people that were in her charge to freedom. If that meant taking a southbound train because they were being pursued by bounty hunters, that's what she would do. She also carried a pistol with her. Sometimes the people that she was trying to rescue became frightened and wanted to return to their previous circumstances, and she used her pistol for encouragement. So that they proceeded upon the path to freedom. And then Mary Ann Shadd Cary in 1853 issued the first edition of a newspaper edited by a black woman when she helped to found the Provincial Freeman, a non-sectarian, non-partisan paper in Chatham, Ontario, Canada, where many black people found refuge when they were escaping from slavery. Mary Ann Shadd Cary has been inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame, which is in Seneca Falls, New York, the birthplace of women's rights. And one of my friends in Denver, whose name is Sandra Shreve, is and I might get this wrong, a great grandniece, I think is the right relationship, of Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who was inducted in 1998, I believe. And then you might know the story of Rosa Parks. There are many women who worked in the civil rights movement. I was telling this woman in the front row, there's a comic strip in the Denver Post. It's called Jump Start. And the cartoonist is an African-American man named Rob Armstrong. And sometime during this month of February, in the past couple weeks, there was a whole part, a series of panels actually, about essays that were being written for Black History Month. And actually the somewhat humorous part of it was that the parents were writing the essays for their kids in school. And the kids were, not very humorous, but probably fairly true, the kids were on the playground, and one of the little boys said, you know, how come nobody wrote about the women in the civil rights movement? I think that's what I'm going to do. And his cohort on the playground says, well, you have 20 minutes. Because that's when recess is over to write this essay. And I actually, I wrote to Rob Armstrong through LinkedIn, and I thanked him for mentioning the women of the civil rights movement. So Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in 1955 on a Montgomery, Alabama city bus. Rosa Parks didn't just all of a sudden one day decide that this was what was going to happen. She had been very active in the NAACP. And that particular day, she said, the only tired I was tired of giving in. She refused to give up her seat. She was arrested. The NAACP decided that this was a case that was worthy of going to court, that she was a suitable plaintiff. And of course, in the end, the laws that segregated the buses in Montgomery, Alabama were declared to be unconstitutional, and that bus boycott lasted for more than a year. I was also saying Martin Luther King was the face of the civil rights movement. And behind Martin Luther King were many women, including Ella Baker, who was instrumental in founding the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and did all of the organizational work for the times when Martin Luther King spoke. Constance Baker Motley, a pioneer in Black civil rights and women's rights, in 1943, when she became the first Black woman appointed to the federal judiciary, and Fannie Lou Hamer in 1964, who made an unauthorized appearance at the Democratic National Convention to request inclusion for African Americans. She also helped with voter registration in the South. And she said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," and it's actually engraved on her tombstone. And I mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. I should have at the same time and in the same breath mentioned Coretta Scott King, his wife, who was very active in the civil rights movement, both during the time that he was alive and then actually for the rest of her life. And from civil rights, now we're going to go to education. In 1793, Catherine Ferguson opened New York City's first Sunday school. Born a slave, with her mother sold when she was 8, she was very sensitive to the needs of destitute children and integrated from its founding. The Murray Street Sabbath School served poor children for 40 years. Fannie Jackson Coppin, in 1869, the first Black woman to head an institution of higher learning in the U.S. Today, that institution is Cheney University, and Coppin University in Baltimore, Maryland, is named in her honor. In 1904, Mary McLeod Bethune, the 15th of 17 children born to former slaves, founded the Dayton Florida Educational and Industrial Training School for Negro Girls. If I remember correctly, she founded it in her home. She had 6 children, including her son, who was not a Negro girl. And she had $1.50 with which to establish the school. Eventually, it became a college, and today it's part of Bethune-Cookman University. Mary McLeod Bethune was an amazing woman who worked in education and civil rights, who advised presidents all through, I think it was 5 presidents she advised. I mean, just an absolutely amazing woman. More educators. Janetta B. Cole in 1987 became the first female president of Spelman College, a historically black college in Atlanta. And one of her more powerful quotes is, "When you educate a man, you educate an individual, but when you educate a woman, you educate a nation." In 1995, Ruth Simmons became the first woman to lead a top university, and that was Smith College. In 2001, she left Smith to be the first female and first black president of Brown University. And then there's politics. I don't know how many of you remember Shirley Chisholm. I had a wonderful experience. I grew up in Virginia. I went to the University of Virginia. I think I was flying to a job interview from what's now called Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C. And there in the waiting area with me was Shirley Chisholm. Just a little person. I mean, I'm a little person too, but such a dynamo. In 1968, she became the first black woman elected to Congress. In 1972, she campaigned for the presidency of the United States. I can't remember the exact count of votes that she got at the Democratic National Convention. It was either 51 or 151, but she actually got a significant number of votes cast for her when she was running for president. The name of her autobiography is Unbought and Unbossed. And she said, "Tremendous amounts of talent are being lost to our society just because that talent wears a skirt." In 1966, Barbara Jordan was the first black person elected to the Texas Senate since 1883 and the first black woman. She was actually mentioned in 1976 as a potential running mate for Jimmy Carter. That would have been really something. She was the first black woman to deliver the keynote address at the Democratic National Convention in 1976. I don't know how many of you have been at the Austin, Texas airport, but both of my brothers live in Austin, and I was just there Super Bowl weekend, actually. That's the Barbara Jordan terminal, and there's a huge statue of her in the baggage claim area. I don't know how many of you remember the Watergate hearings. That was where she really first made her name in the national sphere, and that was Barbara Jordan. Patricia Roberts Harris was the first woman to be named to 2 presidential cabinet positions. First, she was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in 1979, and then she was Secretary of Health and Human Welfare in 1980. At her confirmation hearing, she was asked if she could understand the needs of the poor. And she said, "Senator, I am one of them. You do not seem to understand who I am. I am a black woman, the daughter of a dining car worker. If my life has any meaning at all, it is that those who start out as outcasts can wind up as being part of the system." In 1993, Jocelyn Elders was selected Surgeon General of the U.S. Also in 1993, Condoleezza Rice becomes the first black chief academic officer at Stanford University. Later, she became National Security Advisor in one presidential administration and Secretary of State in another. For me, my exploration of all of these women through history started with looking at women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and for women who were inventors. And so in the upper left, well, on the whole left, is an actual patent docket. This is the actual patent of Sarah Good, who in 1885 got a patent for her folding cabinet bed. Today, what we would call a rollaway or a hide-a-bed, hers actually, when it folded up, it became a desk. Sarah Good lived in Chicago in the 1800s. I mean, this patent's from 1885. And at that time, the apartments in Chicago were very small. And people were looking for pieces of furniture that could provide and had multiple functions. Her father was a carpenter. Her husband was a carpenter. They made this particular piece of furniture that then allowed for so much greater efficiency in these very small Chicago apartments. In 1943, Euphemia Lofton Haynes was the first black woman in the US to receive a PhD in mathematics. Physicist Shirley Ann Jackson, who's a friend of mine, was the first black woman to receive a PhD from MIT in 1973. Today, she is the president of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She's been inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. An absolutely amazing woman. She's a nuclear physicist. She was at Bell Labs for many years and at Rutgers University. And actually, I was with her when she got a special award from the New Jersey Inventors Hall of Fame. In 1987, it says physician Mae Jemison. Well, Mae Jemison was also actually an engineer first, and I'm an engineer, so I like to, talk about that. She was an engineer before she became a doctor, and she was the first black woman selected as an astronaut. And in the upper right, in 2003, robotics research engineer Ayanna Howard was named one of the world's top innovators by Technology Review, and she was working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California at the time. So now we're going to go on a different tack, and we're going to go to literature and the arts. Poet Lucy Terry Prince wrote about an Indian raid in Deerfield, Massachusetts. Her 1746 poem is the earliest existing poem on record that was written by a former slave. Phyllis Wheatley, who came on a slave ship to the colonies when she was about 7 years old and then was taught to read and write, wrote of the suffering of slave women in 1773, and she is the first African-American woman to publish a book. That was in 1773. Very, very significant religious overtones, which are symbolic of the time and the day. She was able to write. She actually met General George Washington, I believe, at his camp because of some of the poems that she had written. The question was, who taught Phyllis Wheatley to read and write? And she learned to read and write. The daughter of the family that she was enslaved with actually taught her. There were actually in many states prohibitions against teaching slaves to read and write, and that was in many cases ignored. So thank you for that question. Prominent black author and poet Francis E.W. Harper spoke and wrote about the cruelty of slavery and lack of education and equal rights for former slaves in the 1860s. Her book sold more than 12,000 copies. Well-known activist, suffragist, and integrationist Ida B. Wells Barnett published a red record in 1895, which was a detailed look at lynching. Zora Neale Hurston, who is still often read today, published Moses, Man of the Mountain in 1939. In 1949, Gwendolyn Brooks became the first black poet to win the Pulitzer Prize. It was a collection of verse titled Annie Allen. And there are many, many more. 1959, A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry made its Broadway debut. It had an entirely African-American cast. the first Broadway play written by a black woman, nominated for 4 Tonys, which was then later made into a movie in 1961. And Lorraine Hansberry was just inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 2017. In 1972, Maya Angelou becomes the first African-American woman to have a feature film developed from her work, the screenplay and musical score, Georgia, Georgia. I had the opportunity to hear Maya Angelou in person. I already told you I'm an electrical engineer, so it always kind of surprises me when someone just speaks totally lyrically. And Maya Angelou just, she writes the way she talks. It's like Cleo Parker Robinson in Denver, who is a dancer. I mean, Cleo just moves. Everything she does is graceful and in the way she moves, and it's just part of her persona. And that was what I saw with Maya Angelou as well. Octavia Butler. I read a lot of science fiction when I was a kid, and she actually wrote in the science fiction and fantasy genre. And then in 1982, Alice Walker published the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Color Purple. And she was the first black woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for a novel. Toni Morrison won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1993 for her body of work, the first black woman to receive that prize. And then 1993, Rita Dove was the first black woman and the youngest person to be named Poet Laureate of the U.S. That's a position that comes through the Library of Congress, and I'm very proud of the fact that she's now actually a professor at my alma mater, the University of Virginia. Some more entertainers, actors and entertainers. I already talked about Hattie McDaniel. Josephine Baker is an actor and entertainer. She had a very difficult time having a career being an African-American woman in the 19-teens and 1920s in the U.S., and she found her way to stardom. Her path was in Paris. Diane Carroll breaks television's color barrier in 1968 by having a television show. Some of you may remember that, I certainly do. Julia, built around her as the central character, and she played a non-stereotypical character and won a Golden Globe. And it would be very remiss of me not to mention at this point Oprah Winfrey, actress, director, producer, talk show host, editorial director of a magazine, co-founder of a women's cable network's television. And what she said just really has so struck me. I have crossed over on the backs of Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Madam C.J. Walker. And I haven't talked about Madam C.J. yet, but I will. I think I've talked about everyone else. Because of them, I can live the dream. I am the seed of the free, and I know it. I intend to bear great fruit. In 1989, Judith Jamison became the first black woman to head a major dance company. My next book, Hollywood Her Story, An Illustrated History of Women in the Movies, has all of these women in it. So I've been researching them a lot in the past 3 years to write this book. In 1990, Whoopi Goldberg won an Academy Award for her work in Ghost. So it was 50 years between when Hattie McDaniel won her Best Supporting Actress work for Gone with the Wind and when Whoopi Goldberg won her Oscar, the second African-American woman and it took 50 years. Halle Berry received the Best Actress Oscar in 2002 and became the first African-American woman to receive that Oscar. Felice Richard was the first black actress to win a Tony, and that was in 2004. Next, I'm going to talk about singers, composers, and musicians. When I learned about Cicerita Jones, I had no idea who she was. She made her singing debut in 1888, you can see on the slide that she's been called the Black Patty. There was an opera singer at that time, a very famous opera singer, Patty, but Cicerita Jones had that skill as well, and so she was called the Black Patty. She actually toured, had her own company. Her troupe actually toured for 20 years, from 1896 to 1916. Hazel Harrison, who was the premier black pianist for 4 decades, launched her career in 1915. I mean, these are women who are achieving very significant firsts earlier in our history. And then probably someone you have heard of, Bessie Smith, who was discovered by Ma Rainey, a huge blues singer and vaudeville singer, in 1919. Ma Rainey herself is the mother of the blues, who signed with Paramount in 1923 and recorded 100 songs between 1923 and 1928. In 1933, Florence Beatrice Smith Price was the first black woman to have a symphony that she composed, performed by a major American orchestra. Ella Fitzgerald, I assume everybody in this audience knows the name Ella Fitzgerald, who won a talent contest at the Apollo Theater in Harlem in 1934, and who, over her career, won 12 Grammy Awards. Now, I mentioned that Marian Anderson is going to be on the back of the $5 bill. She was an opera singer, a contralto, and she was supposed to be giving a concert at Constitution Hall in 1939, but was denied the right to appear at Constitution Hall by its owners, the Daughters of the American Revolution. Instead, she gave a concert at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday, 1939, attended by 75,000 people. And as a result of the DAR denying her the use of Constitution Hall, Eleanor Roosevelt resigned her membership in the Daughters of the American Revolution. Tina Turner, I actually like to talk about her. I mean, she started this fabulous career as a teenager with Ike and Tina Turner, and at age 69, she was still touring and dancing. And then Pearl Bailey, who was born and raised where I was born and raised. She was born and raised in Newport News, Virginia. I was born in Newport News, Virginia, and raised in Hampton. She was appointed in 1970 the U.S. Ambassador of Love by President Richard Nixon. I remember seeing Pearl Bailey singing the lead role in Hello, Dolly in Norfolk, Virginia, probably when I was in college. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but there's a ham in Virginia called a Smithfield ham. It's a very famous ham. And Pearl Bailey comes out in the middle of the first act of Hello, Dolly on the stage in Norfolk, Virginia, and just says something like, "Oh, I could really go for a Smithfield ham." And so at the curtain call at the end of the performance, she was not only handed the bouquet of roses, but someone had gone to the store and gotten a Smithfield ham so that they could give it to her at the end of the performance. I mean, they're really good. Anyway. Someone who we just lost, Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul, the first woman inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987. In 2001, violinist Regina Carter, who began playing the violin at 4, is the first jazz musician to play the 250-year-old Guarneri violin once owned by Paganini. If you are a musician, you will recognize those names. And now we move to athletics. When Charlotte and I were putting this book together, one of her friends said, "You have to put Effa Manley in the book." And Charlotte said to him, "Effa who?" Effa Manley, a co-owner of the former Newark Eagles baseball team of the Negro League in the 1930s, ran the business end of that team for more than a decade. In 2006, she became the first woman elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. A woman who, when you read the articles about her and you read what they put in the Baseball Hall of Fame, who was really the heart and soul of that baseball team. The first black woman to win an Olympic gold medal, that was in 1948, Alice Coachman, who won for the high jump. In 1950, Althea Gibson became the first black woman to play tennis in the US Open. And then she broke the color barrier at Wimbledon and won that as well. After she won Wimbledon, she was given a parade in New York City. And this is Wilma Rudolph, who became the fastest woman in the world at the 1960 Olympics and the first American woman to win 3 gold medals at a single Olympics. But there is so much more to her story. She's from a blended family and was 20th of 22 children in this combined family who had polio as a child and was told she would not be able to walk. But her mother and her family did not accept that prognosis. And her mother drove her, I think it was 90 miles each way, twice a week for physical therapy on her legs. She was a pretty frail child. She was homeschooled until she was in high school, but she learned to walk. And when she was in high school, she was discovered by the coach at Tennessee State, and at 16, she was running for her high school and in the Olympics. So she went from polio and being told she wasn't going to be able to walk to this. The 1960 Olympics were really the first Olympics with significant television coverage, and her story is a made-for-TV story. And so she received significant television coverage in 1960. At the 1988 Olympics, Florence Griffith Joyner set a world record in the 200-meter sprint and won 3 gold medals and a silver medal. Serena Williams, who we all know, became a professional tennis player at age 14 in 1995. In 1995,
you don't mention Venus?
I did. Venus is actually in the book. Serena is in the book, but Venus isn't in the book. It's just the way it kind of worked out. You know, I understand it's not a good thing. I understand they're 2 Williams sisters. I'm really clear on that. You're right. They should both be mentioned. Serena's in the book, Venus isn't. What can I tell you? In 1995, the Nike Air Swoops is the first shoe named after a female athlete, Cheryl Swoops. Violet Palmer was selected as the first black woman referee in a male sports league, the National Basketball Association, the NBA, in 1997. Okay, we finally got to Madam C.J. Madam C.J. Walker is such an important African-American woman. She's such an important woman. The first female self-made millionaire in the U.S., listed in the Guinness Book of World Records in 1905 through her hair and cosmetics business.
Female, not just black.
Female. The first female self-made millionaire, not just black. Female. Total. Madam C.J. Walker found that the cosmetics and hair products that were available for her as an African American woman in the late 1800s were very caustic. I actually think they had lye in them. They were not good for anyone. And they caused her hair to fall out. They caused her skin problems. She actually was in Denver at the time, and she developed some more holistic products. Then she did something that was really pretty amazing for the time. She recruited other women that she trained in the Walker method to train her hair care products and skin care products with the objective of providing them an opportunity to become economically self-sufficient. It's the same model that Mary Kay Ash would use in 1963, but Madam C.J. Walker thought of it first and implemented it first for the Walker method. This is about the time, I mean, at this time, African American women were pretty limited in the career and professional options that they had. And so this was really very, very important. What she did, her sense of community, the economic opportunities that she gave women, and I'm sure it didn't hurt her that she got wealthy as a result. This woman's name is Maggie Lena Walker. And she owned and founded the first African American bank in Richmond, Virginia. The bank's successor is still in business today in Virginia. And when my mother died in 2004 and I was the executor and I was dealing with the bank accounts, one of them was from Consolidated Bank and Trust, which was the successor bank to the one that Maggie Lena Walker established. Way, way back when. It was actually 1903. It doesn't say that on here, but it was. Kathy Hughes, the founder and owner of Radio One, the first radio chain to target the black market. She took the station public in 1999, the largest black-owned and operated broadcast company in the nation. She was the first black woman with a company on the American Stock Exchange. At that time, its value was in excess of $2 billion. And I don't want to forget the women in the professions as well. I mean, there are women everywhere. Rebecca Lee Crumpler became the first woman doctor to earn an MD when she graduated from New England Medical College in 1864. Charlotte Ray was the first black woman to graduate from an American law school when she received her degree Phi Beta Kappa from the Howard University School of Law in 1872. The first black woman lawyer to practice in the U.S. when she opened an office in D.C., and the first woman admitted to the bar in the District of Columbia. Ida Gray Nelson became the first black woman to receive a dental degree in 1890. So when we talk and we think about women in the professions, it's actually been longer. The time frame, the time scale is longer sometimes than we think. Violet Anderson receives her law degree in 1926 and is the first black woman to be admitted to practice before the United States Supreme Court. And this is Mary Washington Wiley, the first black woman CPA in America, who founded Washington Pittman and McKeever, one of the largest black-owned accounting firms in the country. And these are just some of the more than 850 women who are included in her story, A Timeline of the Women Who Changed America. This is the dedication page from the book. My co-author, Charlotte Waisman, and I dedicated the book in memory of our mothers. It starts in 1587 with Virginia Dare, who was born on Roanoke Island, which is today part of North Carolina. We actually don't know what happened to those colonists. That's the lost colony of North Carolina. It goes through 2011. There are many, many women of every description across every endeavor and every age, everything throughout the book. Just a couple of my little favorite stories from the book, in addition to the ones that I've already told you. In 2007, the book used to end in 2007, Drew Gilpin Faust became the first female president of Harvard University. Harvard University was founded in 1636, so it only took 400 years. In 1904, Lena Bryant went to a bank in New York City to get a loan to open her clothing store. She had a revolutionary idea. Actually, she was going to sell commercial maternity clothes. At this point in time in our history, women who were pregnant didn't have clothing options that were commercially available, and most women who were pregnant, depending on their socioeconomic status, did not appear in public during their pregnancy. But Lena Bryant decided that this is what she was going to do, she went to a bank and they spelled her name wrong on her bank loan application. Later, she measured 4,000 women to come up with what at the time, unfortunate term, we would view it today, was called clothing for stout women. Today we call it full-figured women. She determined after measuring these women that there were 3 primary body types, and she developed clothing that was commercially available for them. With her commercial maternity clothes, the newspapers in New York City would not accept her advertisements. They showed pregnant women, and that was deemed lewd. So instead, she opened a mail order catalog business that by 1950 was the 6th largest mail order catalog business in the US. And you know that I'm talking about Lane Bryant. So this quote from Margaret Mead is one of the 2. I usually actually use the other one more, and I'll get to that in a minute. If we are to achieve a richer culture, rich in contrasting values, we must recognize the whole gamut of human potentialities, and so weave a less arbitrary social fabric, one in which each diverse human gift will find a fitting place to the value and the importance of diversity. The other quote from Margaret Mead that Charlotte and I used to start the introduction of our book is, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And to me, that means that it only takes one person to change the world. And everyone in this room can be that one person. So this book really, and the talks that I'm doing, and the work that I'm doing, is to ensure that the young people of today and tomorrow have every opportunity ahead of them. I do have sign-up sheets. I put some of them on the chairs. If you're interested in getting my monthly e-newsletter, I usually profile a couple of women in every monthly e-newsletter. You can sign up on that sign-up sheet. If you're interested in having me come speak to an organization that you're affiliated with, put your information down, and I'll be back in touch with you. And I left time for questions. Oh, and the book, and I have the book for sale, cash, check, or credit card, and I'll personalize it for you. So what questions do you have? This is my favorite part, by the way. Yes, ma'am.
The woman who published the first novel in the 18th century, who published that?
I don't think that I know the answer to that question.
Okay, that's fine.
And sometimes, depending on where they were and how early it was, I think it was the 1600s, it might have actually been published in England.
Okay.
It might not have been published in the US.
Right.
Some of those early publications were there. It's just like with the patents. The early patents were actually issued in London, in England, before we had a country and a patent office.
Yeah, I was just curious about, because it's pretty impressive for a
Yeah,
slave to have a...
I think Phyllis Wheatley's 1773,
That's right, yeah. Phyllis
I
Wheatley.
think that was actually published in Boston.
Okay.
And I know that there's a picture, there was a picture of her, and that picture of her actually comes from the front piece of the book itself, a 2-page spread, which I think is in my book. And I think that spread is at the Massachusetts Historical Society, or whatever the name of that one is. So I'm not sure exactly where it was published, but there are options, and we can certainly find out.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
What else? Yes, sir.
Do you think with the women that are active today in politics that you've got the beginning of another book?
Do I think today with the women who are active in politics that I have another book? Well, since I'm only working on 3 books, no, at the moment, and a video series. It's this information, like what I talked about today, people don't understand the significance of it and how important it is to be known by the broader audience. I'll come back to your question in a minute. I'm now going to go off into a different line for a moment. I believe, like the women who are in politics today, like the Me Too movement, like the Time's Up movement, those movements are important, but not having the success that most women would like for them to have, because, and this is what I've heard it expressed as, and I've adopted this nomenclature, because that's chapter 2. And we haven't actually fixed chapter 1. And chapter 1 is the chapter that says that women and men are both important, and women's accomplishments are important, and that we need to talk about them and learn about them. The standard U.S. history textbook, high school textbook, is 500 pages long-ish. You know, just go with me for a moment. It used to be that 7 of those pages out of 500 mentioned women. It's now improved. It's almost 10%. So that's 50 out of 500 pages mention women. Until we get to some kind of understanding that it requires men and women to, it required men and women to build the country. It required men and women to, and it requires men and women to sustain the country, and it requires men and women to move forward in the country. We're not actually going to get to where this chapter 2 is as effective as it could be. And so, will I write about women in politics? I'd be happy to, but I'm just a little busy right now. What else?
How many patents do you hold?
How many patents do I hold? I don't hold any patents.
Because you were.
I actually, the kind of work that I did was simulation modeling of electric utility operations, and that's not in the realm of patents. However, I actually am the series editor for a series of books called the Women in Engineering and Science series, published by the German publishing company Springer. I will get to the point in a minute. And my volume is the foundational volume, which is the history of women in engineering. And then each subsequent volume targets an area of science or engineering. And then all of the chapters are written on that topic. And the second volume that came out is called Sustainable Agriculture and Food Biotechnology. And that volume editor was my sister. And my sister, Dr. Laura Preval, does have patents, but she's a research scientist. And so she has patents, but the kind of work that I did isn't the kind of work for which you get patents.
Your parents raised underachievers, huh?
All of us. Mm-hmm.
How many?
There are 4, and my sister and I are the 2 that are, we're all trained as scientists or engineers. Oh, interestingly, and the comment was my parents raised underachievers. My father was a PhD engineer at NASA at the Langley Research Center. So for those of you that either read the book Hidden Figures or saw the movie Hidden Figures, except for the unfortunate fact that it was filmed in Piedmont, Georgia, which doesn't look anything like Tidewater, Virginia, where the story is set, that my father, well, okay, there's a picture at the end of Hidden Figures. It's actually in the young adult version of the book and in the movie that shows all of the employees at NASA in 1943 in the hangar. My father had to be in that picture because that's when he started at NASA. And so we are all raised as scientists and engineers, and my sister and I actually went through. One brother's now an airline pilot, and one brother was an air traffic controller. But all of us trained as engineers or scientists. And I have the actual lovely pleasure in March of being at the University of Virginia, where I'll be the panel moderator for a discussion that includes the author of Hidden Figures and one of the women who is profiled in the book. So I'm very excited to have that opportunity. Other questions? We have just a couple. Yes, ma'am.
The women on the money, when is that coming about?
The question is, when are the women on the money going to come about? The women on the money were announced in April of 2016. It was said at the time that the bill that had been most recently revised had been 14 years in that revision. And I can't remember right now which one it is. I think it was maybe it was the 20. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. At one time there was a discussion that maybe the design for the new money would be unveiled in 2020, since 2020 is the 100-year anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which enfranchised women to vote in the US. That's actually August 26, 1920 is Equality Day. And that maybe then the money might actually be issued in 2025 or 2026 or 2027. And the only comment that I'll make is that that was with a previous administration. What else can I answer for you? Any other questions? All right, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be here today.